November 23, 1944. Thanksgiving Day in America. Across the United States, families gathered around tables laden with turkey, stuffing, and pumpkin pie, giving thanks for their blessings, even as their sons and husbands fought overseas. But in a prisoner of war camp outside Fort Stockton, Texas, a different kind of gathering was about to take place. One that would challenge everything 44 young German women believed about their American captors. The women had arrived at the camp 3 weeks earlier, captured during the Allied advance through France. They were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, ranging in age from 18 to 35, who had served as radio operators, nurses, and administrative personnel. Now they stood in formation in the camp's mess hall, their gray uniforms worn, but still bearing the insignia they had once worn with pride. 24-year-old Brunhilde Adler, known as Bruni to her fellow prisoners, maintained the rigid posture she had learned in her training as a communications officer in Berlin. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back severely from her face, and her jaw was set in determination. She had made herself a promise when they were captured: maintain dignity, show no weakness, expect no mercy from the enemy. Beside her stood 21-year-old Gertrude Meyer, a former nurse from Hamburg who everyone called Trudy. Her hands, trained to comfort the wounded, now clasped together tightly as she surveyed the American soldiers moving around the mess hall. 19-year-old Adelheid Hartwig, called Heidi, shifted nervously on her feet. The radio operator from Munich had never been outside Germany before her deployment, and everything about America felt impossibly foreign. Colonel Merritt Townsend, the camp commander, stood at the front of the hall. He was a tall man with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades in military service. Beside him stood Lieutenant Eunice Hargrove, one of the few female officers in the United States Army, whose presence was specifically requested to help manage the unusual situation of female prisoners of war. Colonel Townsend cleared his throat and began to speak. A young corporal translated his words into German for those who couldn't understand English. "Today is Thanksgiving in America," the colonel said. "It's a day when we give thanks for what we have, and we share our abundance with others. You are prisoners of war, but you are also human beings far from home. Today, we will share our Thanksgiving meal with you." The German women exchanged confused glances. Bruni felt her stomach clench with suspicion. Was this some kind of trick? A way to humiliate them? In Berlin, she had been told repeatedly that Americans were barbaric, that they showed no mercy to their enemies, that capture meant degradation and suffering. The mess hall doors opened, and the aroma that filled the room made every German woman freeze in place. It was the smell of roasted meat, of fresh bread, of spices they hadn't encountered in years. Sergeant Winifred Blackwell, called Winnie by everyone in the camp, led a team of kitchen staff carrying enormous platters of food. What the German women saw on those platters would change everything they thought they knew about their enemy. The platters kept coming. Bruni Adler watched in disbelief as Sergeant Winnie Blackwell and her kitchen staff placed dish after dish on the long wooden tables. Roasted turkey, golden and glistening. Mashed potatoes with butter melting into small yellow pools. Green beans, cranberry sauce. Warm rolls that released steam when broken open. Gravy in large ceramic boats. The German women remained standing in formation, uncertain what was expected of them. Some, like young Lotta Pfeiffer, the 18-year-old from Stuttgart, stared at the food with barely concealed hunger. Others, like 28-year-old Inga Schreiber, the administrative clerk from Dresden, kept their faces carefully neutral, still expecting some cruel trick. Lieutenant Eunice Hargrove stepped forward and spoke in halting but clear German. "Please sit, eat. This is not a trick. Today, you are our guests." Her words were translated again by the corporal for clarity. Slowly, hesitantly, the women moved to the tables and sat down. Bruni found herself seated between Trudy Meyer and Heidi Hartwig. Across from them sat several American soldiers, including a young private with sandy hair and kind eyes who introduced himself as Del Swenson. He was from Minnesota, he said, from a farm where his family raised dairy cows. He spoke slowly, using simple English words, trying to bridge the language gap. The women began to eat. At first they took small, careful bites, still wary. But hunger, real hunger that had been their constant companion for months, quickly overcame caution. The turkey was tender and seasoned with herbs none of them could identify. The potatoes were creamy and rich with real butter, not the margarine they had grown accustomed to in Germany. The rolls were soft and warm. Trudy Meyer closed her eyes as she chewed, and Bruni saw tears begin to form at the corners. The young nurse quickly wiped them away, but more came. Around the table, other women were experiencing the same thing. Quiet tears sliding down cheeks as they ate food they had forgotten existed. Then Sergeant Blackwell emerged from the kitchen carrying something new. She moved from table to table, placing a slice of golden orange pie topped with whipped cream in front of each German woman. "Pumpkin pie," she announced with a warm smile. "Traditional American Thanksgiving dessert." Bruni stared at the slice in front of her. The pie was perfectly formed, the crust flaky and golden, the filling smooth and spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg. The whipped cream sat on top like a small cloud. She picked up her fork with a trembling hand. The first bite dissolved on her tongue, sweet, creamy, spiced with warmth. It tasted like abundance, like safety, like everything Germany had denied its people for years, while promising victory. Bruni put down her fork and wept. Not quietly this time, but with deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere she had kept locked away since her capture. Around her, other women were doing the same. Bruni couldn't stop crying. The tears came in waves, each one carrying memories she had tried to suppress. As she sat in that Texas mess hall with pumpkin pie dissolving on her tongue, her mind traveled back to Berlin, to the winter of 1943, when everything began to fall apart. She remembered standing in line for bread at dawn, her ration card clutched in frozen fingers. The line stretched around 3 blocks, and by the time she reached the front, the baker had only hard black bread left, made with sawdust and potato peels to stretch the meager flour supply. Her mother had learned to slice it so thin you could see light through it, trying to make each loaf last a week. Trudy Meyer, still crying beside her, had her own memories surfacing. Hamburg after the firebombing, working in the hospital where they ran out of bandages and had to reuse bloody ones, where patients died not from their wounds but from starvation, because there simply wasn't enough food. She remembered holding the hand of a woman who whispered about her children, about how she had given them her rations until she had nothing left. Young Lotta Pfeiffer had stopped eating entirely. She sat frozen, staring at her plate where half a slice of pie remained. At 18, she had grown up during the war, had never known abundance. In Stuttgart, her family had eaten turnips for breakfast, turnips for lunch, turnips for dinner. When her little brother asked what meat tasted like, no one could answer because no one could remember. Heidi Hartwig pressed her napkin to her face, trying to muffle her sobs. She thought of Munich, of her grandmother who had died the previous winter. Not from the cold, not from the bombs, but from hunger. The old woman had been giving her food to Heidi's younger siblings, lying about having eaten already. By the time they discovered the truth, she was too weak to recover. Inga Schreiber, the oldest of their group at 28, had been an administrative clerk in Dresden. She had processed requisition forms, had seen the numbers that told the real story of Germany's decline. She knew how little food was actually available, how much was being diverted to the military while civilians starved. She had typed reports about productivity declining because workers were too weak from malnutrition to perform their duties. The contrast between those memories and the abundance before them now was almost unbearable. This single meal, this one Thanksgiving dinner, contained more food than many of them had seen in months. The pumpkin pie alone, with its sugar and spices and real cream, represented luxuries that had disappeared from German shops. Years ago, Private Del Swenson watched the women cry and felt something shift in his understanding of the war. These weren't the monsters his training films had shown him. They were hungry young women who had been starved by their own government's ambitions. Dr. Horace Lindstrom, the camp's medical officer, made notes in his journal. Severe malnutrition, he wrote. Emotional trauma from prolonged deprivation. Private Del Swenson didn't know what to do. He had been trained to guard prisoners, to maintain discipline, to keep a professional distance. Nobody had taught him how to respond when the enemy cried into their plates over a slice of pie. He looked across the table at Bruni Adler, who had her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Beside her, Trudy Meyer was trying to compose herself, wiping her eyes with trembling fingers. Young Lotta hadn't moved at all, still frozen in place, staring at her half-eaten dessert as if it might disappear. Del caught the eye of Lieutenant Eunice Hargrove, who stood near the wall observing everything. She nodded at him, a subtle permission to act on his instincts. Del reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, offering it across the table to Bruni. She looked up at him with red, swollen eyes, confusion crossing her face. In her world, enemies didn't offer handkerchiefs. Enemies didn't care if you cried. She took it hesitantly, as if expecting it to be snatched away, and pressed it to her face. "It's okay," Del said softly in English, even though he knew she might not understand the words. "It's okay to cry." Sergeant Winnie Blackwell had stopped serving and stood watching her dining room transform into something she hadn't anticipated. She had cooked this meal thinking it was the right thing to do, the American thing to do. But she hadn't expected this depth of reaction. These women weren't crying from gratitude alone, they were crying from grief, from the weight of realizing how much they had been denied. Dr. Lindstrom moved quietly between the tables, checking on the women with a physician's practiced eye. Some had eaten too quickly and were becoming ill, their shrunken stomachs rebelling against the sudden richness. Others couldn't eat at all, overwhelmed by emotion. He knelt beside Heidi Hartwig, who was hyperventilating, and spoke to her in calm tones, guiding her breathing back to normal. Colonel Townsend watched from his position near the door, his weathered face unreadable. He had fought in the First World War, had seen what hatred between nations could accomplish. This moment, these crying women, reminded him why he had agreed to command this unusual facility. Someone had to break the cycle. Someone had to show that mercy was stronger than vengeance. Lieutenant Hargrove approached Inga Schreiber, who sat apart from the others, not crying but staring at her empty plate with an expression of profound sadness. "What are you thinking?" Eunice asked in her careful German. Ing looked up at her. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "that my government lied to me about everything. If they lied about Americans, about who you are, what else did they lie about?" It was a dangerous question, the kind of question that, once asked, could never be unasked. Around the mess hall, other German women were beginning to ask themselves the same thing. That night, Bruni Adler couldn't sleep. She lay on her narrow bunk in the barracks, staring at the ceiling, her stomach still full from the Thanksgiving meal. Beside her, she could hear Trudy's quiet breathing, punctuated occasionally by a sob. Others were awake too. The darkness was filled with whispers in German, confused voices trying to make sense of what had happened. "They fed us like guests," someone said. "Like family." "It doesn't make sense," another replied. "We were told they would starve us, beat us, treat us worse than animals." Bruni thought back to her training in Berlin, to the lectures about American brutality. The instructors had shown them photographs, told them stories of torture and degradation. They said American soldiers were savages who showed no mercy to prisoners, especially women. Better to die fighting than to be captured, they had been told. Death was preferable to what the Americans would do. Yet today, Private Swenson had given her his handkerchief. Sergeant Blackwell had served her pumpkin pie with a smile. Dr. Lindstrom had treated Heidi's panic attack with gentle hands and kind words. These were not the actions of savages. Young Lotta Pfeiffer spoke from her bunk across the room. "My father told me Americans were monsters. He said they hated all Germans, that they wanted to destroy our people." Her voice cracked. "But that soldier, the one from Minnesota, he showed me a photograph of his family. His mother looks like my mother. His sister could be my sister." "Stop talking," Inga Schreiber said sharply from her corner, but her voice lacked conviction. She was older, had been in the party longer, had more invested in the beliefs she had held, yet even she couldn't deny what they had experienced. "No," Bruni said, sitting up. "We need to talk about this. We need to understand what it means." The barracks fell silent. Then Trudy spoke, her nurse's pragmatism cutting through the confusion. "In Hamburg, we were told the shortages were temporary, that once we won the war everything would be plentiful again, but the Americans aren't winning and starving. They're winning, and they have so much they can share it with their enemies." It was a devastating observation. If America could feed its prisoners pumpkin pie while fighting a war on two fronts, what did that say about Germany's promises of victory, about the sacrifices they had been told were necessary? Heidi whispered, "What if everything we believed was a lie?" The question hung in the dark barracks like smoke. It was the question Ing had asked Lieutenant Hargrove, but now it spread among them all. If the propaganda about Americans was false, what else had they been deceived about? The justifications for war? The necessity of their sacrifices? The righteousness of their cause? Bruni lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. Something had broken inside her today. Not her spirit, but something else. Her certainty. Her faith in everything she had been taught. The days following Thanksgiving brought subtle changes to the camp's atmosphere. The German women still maintained their routines, still stood for roll call, and performed their assigned duties. But something fundamental had shifted. The walls of hostility had developed cracks, and through those cracks, tentative connections began to form. Private Del Swenson found himself assigned to supervise a work detail in the camp garden. Bruni Adler and Trudy Meyer were among the women tasked with preparing the soil for winter. Del had grown up on a farm and knew the work well. Without thinking, he knelt beside Bruni and showed her a better way to turn the earth, his hands demonstrating what his limited German couldn't explain. Bruni watched his technique and nodded, implementing his suggestion. They worked side by side for nearly an hour before either spoke. Finally, Bruni attempted English. "Your farm, Minnesota, you miss it?" Del looked up, surprised and pleased that she was trying. "Yes, ma'am, every day. We had dairy cows, 43 head. My pa and I would milk them every morning before dawn." He paused, then added, "What did you do before the war?" "I worked in communications office, Berlin." She struggled for words. "Sending messages, radio codes." She made a gesture like typing. "My father was a teacher, mathematics." It was the first real conversation they had shared, and it opened a door. Over the following days, Del brought a German-English dictionary to their work sessions. They taught each other words, laughing at mispronunciations, bridging the language gap one halting sentence at a time. Dr. Lindstrom discovered that Trudy Meyer's nursing training was extensive. He began bringing her into the medical office, initially to help inventory supplies, but gradually involving her in patient care. They communicated through a mixture of medical Latin, basic English, and hand gestures. Trudy's competence was evident, and the doctor found himself relying on her more each day. One afternoon, an American soldier came in with a badly sprained ankle. Trudy moved automatically, gathering ice and bandages, elevating the injury, wrapping it with practiced efficiency. The soldier looked uncertain at being treated by a German prisoner, but Dr. Lindstrom said firmly, "Nurse Meyer knows what she's doing. You're in good hands." The title struck Trudy deeply. Not Prisoner Meyer, not German Meyer, Nurse Meyer, as if her skills and her humanity mattered more than her nationality. Sergeant Winnie Blackwell had taken an interest in young Lotta Pfeiffer, who had started volunteering in the kitchen. "Aesthese, Girl watched everything with hungry eyes, not for food, but for knowledge. Winnie began teaching her American recipes, showing her how to make biscuits, how to season a roast, how to bake an apple pie. Lotte absorbed everything. "In Germany," she said one day in broken English, "we forget how to cook. Only turnips, only bread with sawdust. This," she gestured at the kitchen, "this is like magic." "Not magic, honey," Winnie said gently. "Just abundance, and knowing how to use it." Bruni Adler stood in the shower block, letting lukewarm water run over her face. It was early December, 3 weeks since Thanksgiving, and she was wrestling with a feeling she couldn't name. Guilt, perhaps, or shame, maybe both. She had caught herself laughing yesterday. Actually laughing. Del Swenson had been teaching her English idioms and had made a joke about his family's stubborn milk cow. The laugh had burst out of her before she could stop it, genuine and unguarded. Then she had frozen, horrified at herself. How could she laugh with the enemy? How could she feel grateful to her captors? What kind of German soldier found comfort in an American prison camp while her country fought for survival? That evening, Lieutenant Eunice Hargrove found Bruni sitting alone in the barracks, writing in a small notebook. Most of the other women were at dinner, but Bruni had stayed behind. "May I sit?" Eunice asked in German. Bruni nodded, closing her notebook quickly. Eunice sat on the adjacent bunk. "You look troubled." "I don't know who I am anymore," Bruni said quietly. The words came out in German, easier than struggling with English for something so personal. "I was a German communications officer. I served my country. I believed in my duty. Now I sit in an enemy prison camp, and I feel grateful. I feel safe. I feel fed and warm and treated with more dignity than I ever received from my own commanders." She looked at Eunice with desperate eyes. "What does that make me?" "Human," Eunice said simply. "No," Bruni shook her head. "It makes me a traitor. If my fellow Germans could see me now, laughing with an American soldier, learning English, eating your food and feeling thankful for it, they would call me a collaborator. They would say, I've been corrupted by enemy influence." Eunice was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Or they might say, "You've discovered that propaganda doesn't survive contact with reality, that hatred is hard to maintain when people show you kindness." "But that's exactly what I'm supposed to resist," Bruni insisted. "This kindness is supposed to be a trick, a way to make us weak, to break our loyalty." "Isn't it? Is it working?" Eunice asked. "Are you weak?" Bruni thought about this. Was she weak? She still worked hard every day. She maintained discipline. She hadn't abandoned her principles, but her principles themselves had changed. She no longer believed Americans were monsters. She no longer believed her capture was a fate worse than death. She no longer believed that mercy was weakness. "I don't feel weak," Bruni admitted. "I feel confused. I spent years being taught to hate you, being taught that Germans were superior, that our cause was righteous. 3 weeks of being treated with basic human decency has destroyed all of that. If those beliefs were so easily destroyed, were they ever real?" "Maybe," Eunice said gently. "They were never as strong as your capacity to recognize the truth." Inga Schreiber sat at a table in the recreation room, a piece of Red Cross stationery in front of her. Around her, several other German women were attempting the same task, writing letters home to Germany. The Red Cross had delivered mail privileges, allowing prisoners to send short, censored letters to their families. Inge had been staring at the blank paper for an hour. What could she possibly write? How could she tell her mother in Dresden what life was like here without sounding like a traitor? The truth was impossible to share. "We eat well here. The Americans are kind to us." I no longer believe what we were told about them. Those words would mark her as a collaborator, would bring shame to her family, might even put them in danger from suspicious neighbors. Trudy Meyer sat beside her, having already written and crossed out 3 attempts. "I can't do it," she said quietly in German. "Everything I write sounds wrong. If I tell the truth about how we're treated, they'll think I've betrayed Germany. If I lie and say we're suffering, I'm being dishonest. Either way, I'm not the daughter they raised." Heidi Hartwig had managed a few lines, but they were generic and meaningless. "Mother and father, I am well. The camp is adequate. I think of you often. Your daughter, Adelheid." The letter said nothing and everything at once. It confirmed she was alive, but revealed nothing of how she was actually living. Young Lot had given up entirely. She pushed her blank stationery away and put her head in her hands. "My father is a party member," she whispered. "A true believer. If I tell him that the Americans gave us Thanksgiving dinner, that they treat us with respect, that they call Trudy Nurse Mayer like she's one of their own, he would disown me. He would say I've been brainwashed." "Maybe we have been," Ing said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe this is exactly what they intended, to confuse us, to make us doubt everything." Bruni Adler entered the recreation room and saw the group struggling with their letters. She had already decided not to write home. Her parents in Berlin might be dead from the bombing raids. Even if they were alive, what could she possibly say to them? She sat down with the others. "Has anyone actually finished a letter?" she asked. Silence answered her. "We can't tell them the truth," Inga said finally. "But we can't lie either, so we write nothing of substance. We confirm we're alive and leave out everything that matters." "Everything that matters," Trudy repeated softly, "is that we're discovering we were wrong. About America, about the war, about what our country became." She looked around at the others. "That's what we can't write. That we're learning our entire worldview was built on lies. And if we're wrong about this," Heidi added, "what else were we wrong about? What else did our government hide from us?" December 25, 1944. Christmas morning arrived at the Texas camp with unexpected warmth, the winter sun bright against a cloudless sky. The German women had been preparing for this day with mixed emotions. Christmas in captivity, far from home, with their former enemies. Colonel Townsend had announced that, like Thanksgiving, they would share a traditional American Christmas dinner. But this time, he had also given the women permission to create their own German Christmas traditions within the barracks. Lieutenant Hargrove had helped them gather materials to make simple decorations. The night before, the women had sung German Christmas carols, their voices carrying through the camp in haunting harmonies. "O Tannenbaum, Stille Nacht." Songs their mothers had taught them, songs that connected them to a Germany that might no longer exist. Several American soldiers had stood outside the barracks, listening. Private Del Swenson had tears in his eyes. Now, as they gathered in the mess hall for Christmas dinner, the atmosphere was different from Thanksgiving. The initial shock had worn off. The women knew what to expect: abundance, kindness, the cognitive dissonance of enemy hospitality. But this time, they also knew they would have to make decisions about their futures. Sergeant Winnie Blackwell had outdone herself. Roasted ham with pineapple, candied yams, green bean casserole, dinner rolls, and for dessert, multiple pies, apple, pecan, and pumpkin. The tables were decorated with pine branches and red ribbons. Someone had even found a small Christmas tree for the center of the room. Bruni sat with her usual group: Trudy, Heidi, Lotta, and Inge. Private Del Swenson joined them, as had become customary. Dr. Lindstrom sat nearby with several other American officers. The boundaries between prisoners and guards had blurred considerably over the past month. As they ate, Colonel Townsend stood to make an announcement. A translator repeated his words in German. "Ladies, I have news from the War Department. The European conflict is entering its final stages. Planning has begun for repatriation of prisoners of war. In the coming months, you will be given the opportunity to return to Germany." The words fell like stones into water, sending ripples of anxiety through the room. Return to Germany. To what? To whom? The questions they had been avoiding suddenly demanded answers. That evening, back in the barracks, the women held an impromptu meeting. Inga, as the eldest, spoke first. "We need to discuss this honestly. Who wants to return to Germany immediately? Who wants to delay as long as possible?" The silence was telling. Finally, young Lotta spoke. "I have nothing to return to. My city is bombed. My father would reject me for what I've learned here. My mother is probably dead. What am I returning for? Family duty, Inga said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Trudy stood up. I've been thinking about this since Thanksgiving. We have a choice that most prisoners never get. We can choose what kind of people we become after this war. We can choose whether to carry hatred forward or something else. 20 years later, autumn 1964. Bruni Adler Henderson stood in her kitchen in Minneapolis, Minnesota, rolling out pie crust with practiced hands. Through the window, she could see her two children playing in the yard with their father, Dell, who was teaching them how to rake leaves into piles for jumping. She had learned to make pumpkin pie from Sergeant Winnie Blackwell during those final months at the camp. After the war ended, after repatriation began, Bruni had been among 9 German women who requested to stay in America. The process had been complicated, requiring sponsors and legal maneuvering, but the Henderson family, Dell's parents, had offered to help. Eventually, Brunhilde Adler became Bruni Henderson, wife of a Minnesota dairy farmer. The telephone rang. It was Trudy calling from Boston, where she worked as a head nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. They spoke every week, these two women who had cried together over pumpkin pie 2 decades earlier. I'm making the pie, Bruni said in English, though they still sometimes lapsed into German when emotions ran high. For Thanksgiving, next week, the children are excited. Do they know the story? Trudy asked. About why pumpkin pie means so much to us. They know some of it, that their mother was once a German soldier, that their father showed her kindness when he didn't have to, that a piece of pie changed everything. Bruni paused, measuring cinnamon into the filling. I'm not sure they can fully understand. How do you explain to children who've never known hunger what abundance feels like? How do you tell them their mother once believed Americans were monsters? You tell them the truth, Trudy said. That people can be wrong, that they can change, that kindness is more powerful than propaganda. Bruni thought about the others from their group. Lotta had married an American soldier and moved to California, where she taught German at a high school. Heidi had returned to Germany in 1947, but she wrote often about how her experience in Texas had helped her understand America's role in rebuilding Europe. Even Inga, who had been the most resistant, had eventually admitted that the kindness shown to them had been genuine. I've been invited to speak at a veterans gathering, Bruni said. They want me to talk about reconciliation, about how former enemies became allies. Will you mention the pie? Trudy asked. Of course. That's where it all started. That moment when we realized our captors saw us as human beings worthy of dignity. When we understood that everything we'd been taught was a lie, and the truth was so much better than the propaganda. That Thanksgiving, Bruni's children bit into pumpkin pie without knowing they were tasting their mother's transformation, without understanding that this simple American dessert represented the moment a young German soldier learned that mercy was stronger than hatred, that abundance shared was more powerful than scarcity hoarded, and that the sweetest freedom was the freedom to choose who you became.